Today we are going to be talking about Aladdin.
It's the story of a poor boy from the streets and a beautiful girl from a palace.
All of Aladdin.
Watch out! You done wound me up. You ain't never.
So I just watched the new live-action Aladdin movie. I have a lot of thoughts. First off, the original Aladdin movie came out the year that I was born. I grew up with the animated feature. I remember watching that thing to death. Well, as a kid, I was a huge fan. But I saw the live-action film, and I decided I need to rewatch the animated classic and see what it is about the new Aladdin film that didn't sit quite well with me. But as I was watching Aladdin, I remembered the original Aladdin stole a lot of its ideas from another movie. So there's this movie called The Thief and the Cobbler, directed by Richard Williams. Now, Richard Williams was an animator. He was a lead animator on Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It's kind of his biggest project. So Richard had begun working on The Thief and the Cobbler all the way back in 1964. During the course of a long period of time, he would get people to come and help him animate the film. He eventually had something that resembled a feature film by the time he was doing Who Framed Roger Rabbit. So after Who Framed Roger Rabbit, he took this film that he had mostly developed to Disney, and he asked if they would be willing to come and help him finish it. The CEO at the time, he said no, they're not going to do it. Eventually, Warner Bros. Took it over. They basically just hired someone else to finish it. So he had been spending 30 years almost at this point on this film, and he didn't get to put the finishing touches on it. It was somebody else did. Then Miramax somehow gets a hold of it. They don't really like it all that much, but it's 1993 now. Aladdin has just come out, and they decide we're just going to piece it together and try to bank off of Aladdin's success. And they don't bank off of Aladdin's success, which is why you have probably never heard of The Thief and the Cobbler. So it was a commercial failure, and the people who did like it at the time were the people who basically were like super into animation as an art form. Now, in 2020, there is a re-edit of The Thief and the Cobbler available. So if you're interested in watching it, I can post a link in the description, but it's on YouTube. Some fans and animators got together and decided they wanted to preserve this film, and they wanted to make it closer to Richard Williams' original vision. And so it's still unfinished, so there's a lot of frames that are just pencil sketches. Some of them are just still frames. Here's the thing. Multiple people who worked on The Thief and the Cobbler then went over to Disney and ended up working on Aladdin. Richard Williams had pitched the idea of The Thief and the Cobbler, and they saw all that he had in its entirety. And then they made Aladdin a few years later. But there's a lot of things that are in The Thief and the Cobbler that are also in Aladdin. There's a vizier in The Thief and the Cobbler who also is a sorcerer, and his name is Zigzag. So it's not Jafar, but he kind of looks like Jafar. He has a pet bird, so it's not a talking parrot. Instead, it's a talking vulture. Then there's the design of the princess. In both are fairly similar. In The Thief and the Cobbler, the Sultan is just like super lazy. He's sleeping all the time, and he's a womanizer. And instead of making him super lazy, well, he's still super lazy because he's all about playing with toys and stuff, but he's a bit more hyper. He's not sleepy. So he's more like a child. The Thief and the Cobbler are two separate characters in The Thief and the Cobbler. And it looks like Aladdin might be an amalgamation of those two characters. The Cobbler is this noble nobody. He's poor and everything. He's sweet, and he ends up wooing the princess. And the thief is just out to thief. Now this makes some really interesting connections with the themes of the original Aladdin.
Gotta eat to live, gotta still to eat. Tell you all about it when I got the time. One jump ahead of the slow pokes, one skip ahead of my doom. Next time, gonna use a nom de plume.
There's this deep irony going on here. Aladdin is clearly theft of someone else's intellectual property. And this isn't the first or last time Disney has done this. Disney has a long track record of taking other people's ideas and popularizing them. I mean, honestly, The Thief and the Cobbler is not a popularist film. It's very much an art piece. A story that children could like, but it's definitely not a kid's movie. It's more in the vein of like a Ralph Bakshi animation. I don't know if you know Ralph Bakshi, but he did the animated Lord of the Rings and a few other big name stuff, and then he did some more like adult themed stuff. I think that's important for understanding what I think is wrong with the live action remake. So, if Aladdin is a remake of The Thief and the Cobbler that doesn't give The Thief and the Cobbler credit, but that's what it is. Aladdin is a family-friendly remake of The Thief and the Cobbler, basically. And Aladdin 2019 is a remake of Aladdin, the animated film. But Aladdin 2019 doesn't take the elements from The Thief and the Cobbler to the live screen. So it's a remake of a remake without remaking the original property. And I think that's what causes this disconnect. So there's a lot of elements in the live action Aladdin that are quite fun and enjoyable. I thought the dancing was really nice. I thought the acting overall was pretty good, especially from Will Smith and from the guy who plays the Sultan. I think he does a good job. But there's so many elements being fused together that feel mismatched. Like, for instance, there's this scene. Where you can see that the genie is singing about mammals, but he's riding birds. So, I don't necessarily think that this is indicative of the entire project, but you see these kinds of little things here and there. And this is a very nitpicky kind of thing. But let's go beyond nitpicking and look a bit closer at Aladdin himself in the new one. There's no actual goodness about him when we first see him. When we first see Aladdin in the animated film, Aladdin is stealing to survive. He's literally stealing a loaf of bread.
All this for a loaf of bread?
But in the live action one, we have him stealing jewels.
He's a lovely monkey.
That's a lovely necklace.
Which is completely out of character of the original Aladdin. But isn't out of character with the thief from The Thief and the Cobbler. But if Aladdin is an amalgamation of the thief and the cobbler is like pure goodness. I mean, the cobbler gets imprisoned, and he breaks out of prison, and he rescues the mouse that's in prison with him. This is not the character of Aladdin in the live action. The character of Aladdin in the live action is just a thief. And as the film goes on, he never really moves out of that framework. He still sees himself as a suave, cool guy. And, like, when he suddenly stops being confident, when he becomes Prince Ali, it doesn't feel genuine. It doesn't feel part of his character. They just changed something from the original cartoon. And obviously, changes in themselves aren't bad. But you have to know your source material. You have to understand where your story is coming from. And it seems to me very clearly that Guy Ritchie, or whoever else was involved with making the major decisions of the film, Guy Ritchie as the director, weren't really aware, they weren't really cognizant of the fact that The Thief and the Cobbler was the original source of inspiration for this whole endeavor. That their film wouldn't exist without Disney stealing the property from an independent animator who was just trying to make a passion project. Because Aladdin 1992 is great. I still think it's a great film. I think Disney was wrong for doing what they did, but the animated film is very good. And it has some issues. I think its pacing is a little off. Like, it goes a little too quickly, especially towards the climax of the film. But the new movie doesn't try to address those issues. It just makes everything last longer until the climax. And again, it doesn't seem to be aware of the fact that The Thief and the Cobbler was the basis of this whole thing. Now that makes sense, because Disney doesn't want to own up to the fact that they stole the idea from an independent animator. So why would they recognize that that was what's based on? They still stand by the idea and the concept that Aladdin was a completely original idea that had nothing to do with The Thief and the Cobbler and yada yada yada. Like they've gone on record to say that, and they've stood by that statement. The whole thing is just kind of messed up. I'm not telling you to not watch the new live action Aladdin. I still think it's pretty decent. As a film in its own terms, it's okay. Aladdin as a character annoys me. They're obviously going for like hard realism, and there's still a few things in there that like even within like a realistic magical world don't really make sense. Like Iago doesn't really make sense. I wish they had used a real tiger, or at least a real monkey, or at least a real parrot. Any of these animals would have been fine as real things. But those can feel like nitpicks. I think the main thing is that like structurally the new Aladdin doesn't fix the problems that the original Aladdin has, and instead just kind of pans the whole thing out a little bit longer. We already know the story, so we know how it's going to end. So their subtle changes here and there, or drastic changes here and there, don't really do much to make us think about it differently. The biggest problem is that it's unaware of its history. It's unaware of its source material. And I wouldn't be surprised if Guy Ritchie and co. haven't even heard of The Thief and the Cobbler. Or maybe they've heard of it, but they've never seen it. Or maybe they've seen it, but they didn't care. They didn't care to bring the ideas of that movie into their movie. That's the issue. And what's interesting, and what's even more fascinating to me, is that outside of Disney, The Thief and the Cobbler is consistently cited as a source of inspiration for other animation studios. There's an Irish animation studio that has had 2 films directed by Tom Moore, and you may have seen these, and I'd say definitely go see these, because they're both very beautiful films. The Secret of Kells and Song of the Sea. Yeah, so he cites The Thief and the Cobbler as being like direct inspiration for his films, which are not Middle Eastern whatsoever. They're very Irish, his films are. But he uses that same kind of... The Thief and the Cobbler has this finesse of artistic value. It's fascinating watching some of what they came up with to animate. So that is all of Aladdin. As much as I'm going to talk about today. Like, this particular thing could probably be a doctoral thesis in how much is going on here.
Let's not be too hasty.
Still, I think he's rather tasty.
Gotta eat to live, gotta still to eat, otherwise we'd get along.
So, the moral of the story is basically, when given the opportunity to create something, especially when creating something based on something else, it's vital that we have an understanding of the context that we are coming from. The context of the piece that we are creating, the context of our influences, the context of the history of what we're creating. Without an awareness of these things, we run the risk of being offensive, of being insensitive, or we run the risk of making something that's not as good as it could have been. This is a lesson that can be learned by anyone in any field, anywhere in the world. It's not just Disney, and it's not just filmmakers who need to change their habits in how they appropriate other people's work and culture into their own stuff. That's what I have for you today. If you enjoyed what I talked about, please subscribe and hit the like button. Check out the links in the description if you want to know more, or if you'd like to see The Thief and the Cobbler. And I'll see you tomorrow.